You're ruining my big day. My brother Michael screamed when he saw me enter the Grand Meridian Hotel's crystal ballroom in gray sweatpants and a Northwestern hoodie, his voice carrying the kind of entitled rage that only comes from someone who's spent his entire life believing the world should arrange itself according to his preferences. I was standing in the entryway of what was supposed to be the most exclusive wedding Chicago had seen in years, surrounded by 200 of the most carefully selected guests from Chicago's elite business and social circles. Watching my brother's face transform from shock to anger to a kind of purple-faced fury that suggested he was experiencing a genuine crisis. The wedding was scheduled to cost approximately $847,000. The guest list was curated with the precision of someone planning a political summit. Every detail had been selected to project a specific image. That Michael Harrison was a man of taste, success, and unquestionable status. And here I was, his sister, dressed like I'd just rolled out of bed, apparently determined to sabotage everything he'd spent the last 18 months planning. My mother gasped. My father stepped toward me as though he might physically prevent me from proceeding further into the room. My brother's fiancée, Amanda, looked genuinely confused about whether this was some kind of elaborate prank. And I calmly replied, in a voice that was quiet enough that only the people immediately around me could hear it. It's my big day. I own this venue. And now I'm shutting it down. The silence that followed that statement was the kind of profound, absolute quiet that happens when everyone in a room simultaneously realizes they've misunderstood something fundamental about the situation they're in. My name is Evelyn Harrison, and I'm 41 years old, which means I've lived long enough to understand that sometimes the most powerful position to occupy is the one nobody expects you to be in. I come from a family that is solidly upper middle class, the kind of family where the men build businesses and the women marry successfully or become decorative versions of their mothers. My father, Robert, built a venture capital fund that became moderately successful. My mother, Patricia, comes from old money and has spent her life managing the social aspects of being married to a man in finance. And then there's my brother Michael, 3 years older than me, who was groomed from childhood to eventually run the family business or start something equally impressive. And then there's me. I was supposed to be the decorative daughter. I was supposed to attend the right schools, make the right connections, marry the right man, and eventually become the kind of woman who hosts charity galas and sits on the boards of cultural institutions. That was the trajectory everyone in my family assumed I would follow. That was the vision my mother had for me before I was old enough to articulate that I had my own ideas about what I wanted my life to look like. But something shifted when I was 11 years old, and I visited the Grand Meridian Hotel for a family event. I was backstage, literally, the staff areas of the hotel, and I became fascinated by how the entire operation functioned. I watched the event managers coordinate with the catering team. I watched the technical staff manage the lighting and sound. I watched the front-of-house staff manage the flow of guests. I watched the kitchen produce hundreds of meals in precise sequence. I watched all the invisible infrastructure that made the visible spectacle possible. I asked so many questions that one of the event managers, a woman named Diane, actually took me under her wing and explained how event venues operated, how the business model worked, what the profit margins looked like, how decisions got made about space utilization and pricing and vendor relationships. I was 11 years old, and I'd found what I wanted to do with my life. My parents reacted with confusion when I told them I wanted to go to business school with a focus on hospitality management and venue operations. My mother suggested I was going through a phase. My father suggested I should probably get a business degree and then figure out what to do with it, something that sounded more impressive than hospitality management. But I was determined. I went to Cornell University and got a degree in hospitality management. I worked at major hotel groups and event venues throughout my college years and afterward. I learned every aspect of the business, from the financial models to the operational logistics to the client relationship management to the staff coordination to the physical infrastructure. By 30, I'd been promoted to general manager of a mid-sized luxury hotel in downtown Chicago. By 33, I had an opportunity to purchase the Grand Meridian Hotel, the same hotel where, at 11 years old, I'd watched the event management operation and decided what I wanted to do with my life. The Grand Meridian was in decline. The previous ownership had let it deteriorate. The staff was demoralizing. The venue was booked at 60% capacity when it should have been operating at 95%. The facilities needed updating. The operations were inefficient. It was a classic case of an asset with significant potential being mismanaged by ownership that didn't understand the business. I purchased it with financing from a private equity group that believed in what I could do with it. I spent the first 2 years systematically renovating and restructuring. I updated the facilities. I hired and trained a new management team. I implemented new operational systems. I created a sophisticated technology platform for booking and management. I rebuilt the reputation from the ground up. Within 5 years, the Grand Meridian was operating at 98% capacity. I was hosting approximately 120 events per year, ranging from corporate conferences to weddings to galas to private events. The hotel had been transformed from a liability into one of the most successful luxury event venues in the Midwest. My revenue had increased by 340%. My profit margins had improved dramatically. And my net worth, primarily derived from the equity I held in the property and the company, was approximately $240 million. What nobody in my family knew was that I owned the Grand Meridian. I'd deliberately kept it private. I'd never mentioned it at family events. When family members asked what I was doing for work, I'd given vague answers about being in hospitality management or real estate. I'd never corrected their assumptions that I was working for someone else, managing a hotel or event space on behalf of an ownership group. I'd done this deliberately, partly because I enjoyed the privacy, partly because I didn't want to deal with family members asking for favors or special treatment, and partly because I was curious to see how my family would perceive me if they didn't know how successful I'd actually become. The answer to that question had become apparent over the years. They didn't perceive me as particularly successful at all. My mother made occasional comments about how nice it must be to work with people and events, as though that was a lesser form of work than what my father did with his venture capital fund. My brother had never asked in detail what I actually did. The assumption in family conversations was that I was doing something competent, but ultimately unimpressive, something that I probably would have abandoned by now if I'd been able to marry well. Then Michael announced his engagement to Amanda, and he announced that he wanted to have his wedding at the Grand Meridian. I received the booking request through my standard channels. One of my event managers came into my office with the details. A 700-person wedding, black tie, 3-course dinner, the full luxury experience, expected cost of approximately $847,000. The clients were requesting the ballroom, the reception areas, the entire venue essentially for the entire evening. The date they wanted was available. It was an extremely lucrative booking. The clients listed on the booking form were Michael Harrison and Amanda Voss. My brother, my soon-to-be sister-in-law. Neither of them apparently recognized the ownership of the venue as being in any way connected to me. I had several options. I could have just accepted the booking like any other client, and nobody would have needed to know that I owned the venue. My brother would have come to his wedding at the Grand Meridian, had his expensive event, and left without ever realizing that his sister owned the place. But something in me, something that I'm not entirely proud of, but which I also don't regret, wanted him to know. I wanted him to understand in a very concrete and visceral way that his sister had built something significant, that his sister owned a multi-million-dollar property that was one of the most successful event venues in the Midwest, that his sister was operating at a scale of success that was arguably equivalent to or exceeding his own. I accepted the booking. I met with Michael and Amanda to discuss the details. Neither of them asked me directly who owned the venue. They just assumed I was the event manager coordinating their event. I didn't correct their assumption. As the wedding approached, I became increasingly aware of how Michael was talking about this event in family settings. He was positioning it as the pinnacle achievement of his social status. He was talking about hosting this exclusive event at this prestigious venue. He was talking about which important people had been invited and which others had been excluded. He was talking about how impressive the event would be and how it would position him in the social hierarchy. He was never giving credit to the venue itself, to the infrastructure and expertise that made the event possible. He was claiming ownership of everything: the elegance, the exclusivity, the sophistication. The venue itself was just backdrop to his own importance. 3 days before the wedding, I made a decision that was partly petty, partly strategic, and partly designed to teach a very specific lesson about humility and recognition of what you actually benefit from in life. I called Michael and told him I needed to reschedule the wedding. I told him there was a critical infrastructure issue at the venue that required emergency repairs. I told him we'd need to find an alternative location or an alternative date. He freaked out. He came to my office at the Grand Meridian in person, furious, demanding to know how this could possibly have happened, suggesting that he was going to sue the venue, threatening to destroy the reputation of the hotel if his wedding was canceled or delayed. I let him vent. I let him express his rage and his sense of entitlement and his certainty that his wedding was more important than the operational considerations of the hotel. And then I told him the truth. Michael, I own this venue. I've owned it for 7 years. I've built it into one of the most successful event spaces in the Midwest. Your wedding is important to you, but it's not more important than the actual operation of my business. If I say there's an infrastructure issue that needs addressing, then that's what's happening. His face went through several iterations of shock, confusion, and anger in rapid succession. You own this place, he stammered. I do. I've never mentioned it because I wasn't particularly interested in dealing with family members asking for special favors or discounts or insider information. But since you're planning your wedding here, I thought it was probably time for you to know. He asked if this was some kind of joke. He asked why I'd never told him. He asked if the infrastructure issue was real or if I was making it up to punish him. I told him the infrastructure issue was real. There was an HVAC system that needed replacement that I'd been planning for the following month. But given the wedding circumstances, I could accelerate the schedule if he wanted to proceed. It would require the wedding to happen on my terms, in a modified setup, with full transparency about the venue's operations and my ownership. He didn't like it. He wanted everything to happen according to his original plan. He wanted the perfect venue, the perfect event, the complete confirmation of his social status through a perfectly executed wedding. What he got instead was a wedding that would happen in a venue whose owner was his sister, a venue that he suddenly had to understand was not actually his backdrop but was instead his context. His wedding was not the important thing. His wedding was one event in the ongoing operation of a multi-million-dollar business that his sister owned and managed. The wedding happened as originally planned. I didn't actually shut down the venue. That was a bluff designed to get his attention and to make him understand what I was capable of. But I did something more subtle than shutting down. I made myself visible. I wore the sweats intentionally, deliberately positioning myself as someone who didn't need to meet his dress code expectations, someone who had the authority to show up however I wanted to show up because I owned the place. When he raged at me for ruining his big day, I responded with that statement. It's my big day. I own this venue. And now I'm shutting it down. I didn't actually shut down the venue. Instead, I walked through the event as the owner, checking on operations, making decisions, addressing issues, being present in a way that made it clear who actually had power in this situation. The guests quickly figured out what was happening. Word spread through the event. People started approaching me to congratulate me on the venue. People started asking about my business. People started positioning me differently in the social hierarchy than they had been moments before. My parents figured it out. My father actually seemed impressed, which was a new experience for me. My mother looked shocked, as though she couldn't quite reconcile the idea that her daughter was a successful business owner with her preconceived notions about what her daughter should be doing. Michael watched all of this unfold throughout the evening. He watched me be recognized by people he respected. He watched me discuss my business with their venture capital contacts. He watched me exist in a sphere of success that was equivalent to his own. By the end of the night, he approached me and actually apologized for how he'd treated me throughout the evening. He said he hadn't realized what I'd accomplished. He said he was impressed. He said he wanted to understand more about my business. I accepted his apology politely. I answered his questions professionally. But something had shifted in our relationship in a way that I don't think can be unshifted. He'd learned that his sister was not who he thought she was. He'd learned that I'd built something significant while he was essentially inheriting or building moderate success based on family connections and venture capital backing. He'd learned that I had my own empire, my own success, my own power. What I learned from the experience was something about the nature of family dynamics and how much of what we believe about each other is based on assumptions rather than actual knowledge. My family had assumed I was doing something competent, but ultimately unimpressive. They'd been wrong. Michael had assumed that his wedding was the most important thing happening at the venue that evening. He'd been wrong about that too. The decision to wear sweats was deliberately provocative. It was designed to signal that I didn't need to perform respectability according to his standards, that I could show up however I wanted because I had the authority to set the terms. It was also designed to make a point. That success doesn't always look like what you expect it to look like, that powerful people don't always look the way you think powerful people should look, and that family members who've been invisible to you might have entire empires that you've never bothered to notice. The threat to shut down the venue was never going to be implemented. But the underlying message was real, that my brother's wedding was happening on my property, according to my rules, in a venue that I controlled. He had no authority here. He had no power here. I did. That was the lesson I wanted him to learn. Not in a vindictive way, but in a way that would force him to recalibrate how he understood his own position in the world and his position relative to the people in his family. Did it work? I think so. Michael is more respectful now. He's more curious about what I do. He stopped assuming that his work in venture capital is inherently more impressive or important than what I do in hospitality and venue management. But I also think something in our relationship shifted in a way that made it less innocent and more transactional. We can never go back to the dynamic we had before, where he didn't know that I owned the venue, where he could dismiss what I did for work without understanding its actual scope. In some ways, that's good. In some ways, it's a loss. But mostly, I think it's just the natural consequence of finally allowing someone to see who you actually are instead of allowing them to continue believing the story they've constructed about you. The Grand Meridian continues to operate. Michael and Amanda send me a holiday card every year with a photo of them in front of the venue. I'm not sure if they're positioning it as a subtle acknowledgement of my success, or if they're just enjoying the memory of their wedding. But either way, the card sits on my desk as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is simply being visible, being successful, and refusing to perform the humility that other people expect from you. The sweats were sweats. The threat to shut down the venue was a threat. But the message was real. I exist at a level of success and authority that my family had been unwilling or unable to see. And once they saw it, they couldn't unsee it.